Okay, good afternoon. My name's Tanya Carlone. I'm a facilitator with the Center for Collaborative Policy, so I'll be with you for this public comment meeting on the sustainable management criteria, as well as we'll receive a demonstration on the new Sigma portal tool. I'll get into the details of what we hope to accomplish at the meeting today after Trevor Joseph with DWR gives some introductory remarks. Okay, thank you for being here.
All right, thank you, everyone. Again, my name is Trevor Joseph. I'm one of the program leads with the Department of Water Resources, a Sustainable Groundwater Management Program. And appreciate you coming out today. And for those of you on the webcast, thank you. Today, we want to really accomplish three things. One is we have a draft best management practice document, what we're calling the Sustainable Management Criteria. And we're interested in your public comments today on that document. That should take a good portion of today's meeting. We also have what we're calling a notification tool that Stephen Springhorn, my colleague, will present. And again, this is a tool where we want to demo and provide you an overview and get your comments on that tool. And we'll explain that in obviously some detail. And then finally, we have kind of an engagement process that we are have rolled out in terms of department point of contacts in our regional offices. Today, we have folks from our Northern Region office stationed in Red Bluff in the audience. Can you raise your hands, please? When we have folks from our North Central Regional office in West Sac, can you raise your hands? And so we'll go through that point of contact engagement concept briefly today at the end of the meeting. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Tanya, and maybe you can walk us through some additional detail.
Thanks, Trevor. So we do have a webcast today. Just wanted you to be aware of that, and the webcast will be available and posted to DWR's website in the coming days and weeks. Please, as it says there, please turn off your cell phones during the meeting today. We appreciate that. Okay, so I'm taking a look at the agenda. I think that Trevor gave a really good overview of what we're going to do today. So what I'd like to focus on, and just some of my opening remarks, is to talk to you about how you can make comment. So there is a meeting announcement handout that is available on the table outside the door, and it tells you the various ways that you can make your comments. So you can make comments orally today, and if you intend to make oral comments, we're going to ask you to fill in this speaker card. That will happen a bit later today, but please do fill that out. If you would like to, in addition to those oral comments, or aside from those comments, just make written remarks, please use this comment card. If you did not receive that, I can hand them out to you, and they're more out on the table. And as it says in the meeting announcement, you can also go ahead and submit written comments to the SGMPS email address that's on this document. You may also do it by mail. And all of those comments need to be in by January 8th of 2018, which is just right around the corner. Okay, so I will tell you more about that when we actually get to the public comment period on the sustainable management criteria after Trevor's presentation on the subject. Okay, so with that, why don't we just go ahead and get right into it, Trevor?
Thank you. So the topic of the Sustainable Management Criteria, BMP, this draft document, it really gets into a lot of new terminology, a lot of detail that frankly is not necessarily easy to explain. And we've tried to do our best in describing the requirements and ways to approach completing these requirements that are described in the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, as well as the Groundwater Sustainability Plan regulations to the best of our ability. But that's where your involvement is really helpful. You can help us shape this document through your public comments to ensure that it's value added to you, because ultimately this document is most important to us if, in fact, you, the audience, you, the stakeholders, understand the specific details. So for purposes of background, just really quickly, many of you have seen this slide before, but the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was really kind of a major activity, a major milestone in California groundwater. Prior to SGMA, groundwater was really voluntary in terms of management. It was really kind of a carrot approach, meaning that folks would do groundwater management to be eligible for state grants and other opportunities. But it was semi-effective, if you will, that in many areas it did not cover the entire groundwater basins or subbasins, and there was various levels of implementation. After the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act passed in 2014, in the fall of 2014, it became effective January 1st, 2015, it's moved to a required set of requirements for groundwater management to avoid state board intervention in high and medium priority basins. And this really is focused on entire basin planning, and the Act gives new authorities to these groundwater sustainability agencies. An important point here is local agencies, or these GSAs, have 20 years to reach sustainability. So again, for the purposes of background, there's really four main entities identified in the Act. There's the local agencies that really have the lion's share of the work in terms of SGMA implementation, those being the groundwater sustainability agencies, as they need to plan and implement to avoid undesirable results, or to achieve sustainability, I should say. The department that I work for, DWR, we do the regulatory, the evaluation of these plans, as well as assist the local agencies. The state board is the enforcing agency in the event that local agencies are unable to reach sustainability. And then the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is very unique in that it has a lot of references to stakeholder engagement. And the stakeholder process is really throughout the Act and throughout the Groundwater Sustainability Plan regulations. Again, for the purposes of background, high and medium priority basins must comply with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in order to avoid state board intervention. They're shown in the right. Those high and medium priority basins are shown in yellow and orange. And then sustainability is really a complicated set of definitions in the Act, or could be somewhat of a complicated set of definitions. And one way to look at this is that the pyramid here shows kind of the core requirement of avoiding undesirable results, and I'll get into that in more detail, is material here to achieving sustainability, achieving the sustainable yield in the basin, completing and achieving sustainable groundwater management, and ultimately achieving the sustainability goal. And it's this description of these components that's really the focus of the Sustainable Management Criteria draft best management practice document.
Trevor, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm not just texting personal texts over here. I'm getting some input from others at DWR offsite that for those of you who are on the webcast, I understand that some of you are having difficulty hearing it. We've done whatever we can on our end. I know that some of you said that it is fine. So just realize that the recording will be available, so we apologize if you're not hearing it very well. Okay, thank you.
Finally, for the purposes of background, there's a series of activities and achievements that the department and local agencies have achieved since the Act became effective. They're shown here. I won't go through all the details, but the point here is that the department has an obligation in the Act to develop best management practice documents. And that due date was actually the end of last year, January 1st, 2017. And we achieved that through a series of best management practice documents. But in the spirit of providing additional assistance, technical assistance in particular, the department is investing in continuing to develop BMPs such as this draft a Sustainable Management Criteria document. Okay, so now let's get into the meat. Again, this is where you're really going to have to try to, I'm going to have to try to convey this very clearly and carefully because it gets very kind of dense from here, to be honest. So I'm going to give an overview of the draft Sustainable Management Criteria BMP. I'll try to hit the highlights of this draft document. And then I'll describe an example here at the end in terms of how this can be approached in an illustrative way. So again, I made mention of this. I won't repeat this, but we have this obligation to develop best management practices. I do want to make mention that this is one of 3 public meetings that we'll have. Tomorrow we'll be in Visalia, and then Wednesday in Santa Ana to provide an overview and seek comments from stakeholders. We maybe should make an important characterization here in terms of the BMP versus groundwater sustainability regulations. So the groundwater sustainability plan, I should say, regulations were became effective mid to late last year, 2016. Excuse me, actually August of 2016. And they lay out the actual requirements, the information the department needs to see in groundwater sustainability plans to do our role in evaluating whether or not these basins are sustainable. BMPs are technical assistance. They are optional. Local agencies, GSAs, stakeholders can choose to use these BMPs if they want, but they do not have to. And again, to my point earlier, they're really only beneficial to us if they are clear and beneficial to local agencies and stakeholders. I will make mention that we prepared 2 BMPs by the end of last year, specifically related to monitoring, that are located here or described here on the slide, BMP number 1 and 2. And those are specifically referenced because there is a requirement in the groundwater sustainability plan regulations that you either have your own BMPs as it relates to monitoring or that you adopt the department's. And so for those interested in potentially adopting the department's BMPs on these requirements, you should focus in on those 2 documents. We also last year did a survey looking at what stakeholders felt was the more important topics for the department to potentially develop BMP content. And the results of this survey we shared last year, but I want to make note here that establishing measurable objectives, the assessment of undesirable results, a lot of these terms, a lot of these requirements in the Sustainable Management Criteria BMP were identified last year. And so we feel obviously fairly confident that we're hitting something that is something that's probably needing characterization, perhaps needing some description in terms of ways to potentially approach it with stakeholders. So again, this just highlights prior best management practices and documents that the department's put out and other guidance documents. Again, by the end of last year, we prepared 5 technical best management practice documents in final form, and we've prepared a couple of guidance documents by the end of last year, and we've prepared a couple since that, shown there on the right. So let's get into the sustainable management criteria. This just highlights, specifically in the GSP regulations, Article 5, the plan content. This is really kind of the main article that describes all of the requirements that local agencies or GSAs need to address in their groundwater sustainability plans. Subarticle 3 is the sustainable management criteria, and it has these 4 terms: sustainability goal, undesirable results, minimum thresholds, and measurable objectives. These are terms that, frankly, I think are new, obviously, to all of us with the Act or the GSP regulations, new terminology. The other subarticles, as you can see, we've touched on in other BMPs or guidance documents. So undesirable results and sustainability indicators. Again, for the purposes of background, here is a description of actually what's in the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, although I've shortened the description of chronic lowering of groundwater levels. And again, here's that pyramid that kind of describes ways to think about those requirements and the avoidance of undesirable results, which are identified in the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, as a key requirement in order to show sustainability in a basin. So we have these little icons. It's a little hard to see for each of these undesirable results, and shown here: chronic lowering of groundwater levels, reduction of groundwater storage, seawater intrusion, degraded water quality, land subsidence, and depletions of interconnected surface water. Sustainability indicator is a term that we used in the groundwater sustainability plan regulations that is really defined as any of the effects caused by groundwater conditions occurring throughout the basin when significant and reasonable cause undesirable results. Key here is that sustainability indicators are those effects caused by groundwater indications. They're only undesirable results when it's significant and unreasonable. And we'll touch on that more. So in terms of how the document's set up, and we really spent a lot of time on this document. At one point, frankly, we had a series of steps, but it seemed artificial and it didn't flow very well. And so we've actually moved to less of kind of a prescriptive approach to this document, and more to just some general descriptions. The document, the draft document, hopefully you saw it on the desks outside, picked up a version, and hopefully you've had time to look at it. But it really starts out with identifying some preliminary activities. So understanding the basin setting. And again, we've touched on this topic in other best management practice documentation. Inventorying existing monitoring programs is described as a preparatory activity in the draft SMC BMP. And then engagement with interested parties in the basin. Again, identified in the draft document as a preliminary step. And again, we have some guidance documents that address ways to approach that condition, that activity. So assessing sustainability indicators is what we felt is the next topic in the document that warranted some discussion. So really, the key here, we feel, is to start by assessing all 6 sustainability indicators. So in the document, we describe, the default position that all 6 should apply, unless you can prove with information that demonstrate that they don't apply. So an example of this, simple example, might be seawater intrusion. If you're in a basin where there's no coastal access or ability for saline water to intrude into the basin, it's probably pretty clear that sustainability indicator, that undesirable result, will not occur in your basin. Other areas where it may not be that clear: surface groundwater interaction, specifically the depletion of interconnected streams. This is a condition in some areas, in some basins, it won't apply because streams are disconnected. However, there is a responsibility of the GSA to describe and demonstrate why a sustainability indicator doesn't apply in a given basin. So then the next step here is to each indicator and consider the conditions that would represent significant or reasonable. And again, this is a locally driven process that ultimately the GSA, the Groundwater Sustainability Agency, is responsible for describing in their groundwater sustainability plan. So local decision based on local conditions and concern. Again, this is where that stakeholder engagement and involvement weighs in heavily in terms of defining what constitutes potential significant or reasonable conditions in a basin. Consideration and use of management areas, again described in the GSP regulations, not shown in detail here, but an opportunity for local agencies to define the areas of their groundwater sustainability plan differently because there's different considerations, different ways to set up monitoring or to the description of plan elements using management areas. And then develop initial representative monitoring sites. So again, the thought being that there should be some acknowledgement of what monitoring you have up front in order to define what causes undesirable results or significant and unreasonable conditions in your basin. So imperative that you understand your existing monitoring sites up front for the purposes of defining sustainability. So the next topic or term used in the Sustainable Management Criteria BMP and in the Groundwater Sustainability Plan regulations is this term minimum thresholds. The key here with minimum thresholds is it's a quantitative value at a given monitoring site that may cause undesirable results in the basin. So let me step back. We've talked a little bit about that pyramid. You know, description of undesirable results, very key in your groundwater sustainability plans for the purposes of identifying what constitutes sustainable conditions in your basin. The tool to define undesirable results is minimum thresholds. So this is at a given site, a monitoring well or other site where you can quantify groundwater conditions or another sustainability indicator to define what's undesirable in your basin. So again, I made mention at each representative monitoring site. What this graphic shows here, a little small, this is a illustration of a potential basin, and there are dots here, and specifically identification of certain dots representing monitoring wells, certain wells to set up minimum thresholds in order to define what are undesirable results in your basin. So minimum thresholds, the GSP regulations describes specifically for each of the sustainability indicators, and again there's 6 there, the specific metrics that are required to define and to quantify the minimum threshold requirements. So for groundwater levels, groundwater elevation, seems pretty logical that that's the metric that you use to quantify those groundwater levels or that sustainability indicator. For reduction of storage total volume, seawater intrusion, chronic concentration of the chloride concentration isocontour. For degraded quality, migration of plumes, number of supply wells, volume, or location of an isocontour. This is a really kind of a challenging sustainability indicator to quantify using a minimum threshold, but there is some detail in the Sustainable Management Criteria BMP. For land subsidence, rate and extent of land subsidence. For surface water depletion, the volume or rate of surface water depletion. So these are the sustainability indicators and these are the metrics. And I'll describe more how you can use groundwater levels as a proxy for all of them, meaning that local agencies or GSAs have the opportunity to use groundwater levels instead of the metrics identified here for these sustainability indicators. So minimum thresholds. In the GSP regulations and what's described in the draft Sustainable Management Criteria BMP is there's additional information required when you set these minimum thresholds or specific information. One is what information and criteria did you use to set those minimum thresholds? 2, what is the relationship between the minimum thresholds for each sustainability indicator? 3, how does that minimum threshold potentially aid in avoiding causing undesirable results in adjacent basins? What are the effects to interested parties or beneficial uses and users of groundwater or land uses and property interests when setting that minimum threshold? How does that minimum threshold relate to state, federal, or local standards? And it does not need to match state, local, or federal standards, by the way. We receive a lot of questions for water quality. Do I have to use the MCL? No, you do not. You can use a different threshold. But there needs to be a description of how it is set up in relation to state, federal, and local standards, if applicable. And then finally, quantitatively measured, is it consistent with the monitoring network requirements? How does that minimum threshold get set up with those monitoring requirements? So I'm going to only go through one example. Again, there's 6 sustainability indicators. Specifically, I'm just going to use chronic declining groundwater levels. This is a visual from the draft document that shows a illustration purposes only. There's no real data behind this that shows that minimum threshold. And in this example, you can see here that the data actually goes below the minimum threshold. It looks like in 2022, for those of you with sharp eyes, but then comes back up. And so this also points to just one representative monitoring site. So this is just one representative monitoring site in the basin. So the question is here, how do I set up minimum thresholds? What other considerations? How should I look at this? And there's a series of considerations identified in the draft best management practice document. So again, new term, a lot of questions as to how to set up minimum thresholds. Here are some questions that you may want to discuss with stakeholders or work through when setting minimum thresholds in your given basin for chronic lowering of groundwater levels. The historic groundwater conditions, and a lot of these, frankly, seem fairly obvious to us, to be honest, but we're trying to provide a comprehensive list for discussion purposes. And again, I'll interject here if this is where we'd really like input ultimately on what are those considerations, what is most value added to GSAs and stakeholders working through this process. But obviously, again, I won't go through all of these, but the screen intervals of the wells, the historic groundwater conditions, which aquifer is the well screened in. A lot of these elements or considerations we feel are valid. And again, the document actually has considerations for the other 5 sustainability indicators. So again, I encourage you to look at those. I made quick mention of the use of the term proxy. Again, groundwater elevations can be used as a proxy for other metrics, setting up sustainability indicator minimum thresholds. So in doing so, the GSP, though, must demonstrate the significant correlation between groundwater elevations and other metrics. Frankly, we feel that this is something we likely will see a lot of in groundwater sustainability plans. A lot of agencies may not have necessarily all of the monitoring equipment to use for some of the other metrics. And so early on, we anticipate that a lot of agencies may use groundwater elevations to help identify minimum thresholds in their basin for those other sustainability indicators. Okay. Moving along, measurable objectives and interim milestones. So again, these are topics addressed in the draft document. Measurable objectives is somewhat similar to minimum thresholds in that it is a quantitative value at a specific site. So like minimum thresholds, for example, chronic lowering groundwater levels at a representative monitoring site, there should be a corresponding measurable objective. And that measurable objective refers to really the goal and maintaining or improving the conditions at that given site. So as illustrated in this graphic, the measurable objective is above the minimum threshold, and it is above it in terms of establishing a margin of operational flexibility. What we mean by this is that when setting measurable objectives, this is really your goal that you want to hit. You don't want to operate the basin at a minimum threshold at a given site. You're hoping to operate it at the measurable objective. But you are not penalized in the department for not achieving the measurable objective because the measurable objective does not define undesirable results in the basin. And it's the definition of undesirable results is really the key in terms of whether or not ultimately you are achieving sustainability. And again, it's those minimum thresholds that are used to define undesirable results. Interim milestones are essentially every 5-year progress points, and they represent the measurable groundwater conditions that you hope to achieve during your 20-year implementation period to either maintain or avoid undesirable results in your basin. So again, at a representative monitoring site here, this graphic shows the date at which the plan was adopted. There's a recognition here by the GSA in this hypothetical example that groundwater levels might go lower for a period of time identified on their interim milestones. But ultimately, in this example, the GSA hopes to have the measurable objective, meaning where groundwater levels end up over the 20-year implementation period, essentially almost equal to the GSP adoption date. By my eye, it looks like a little bit higher, but again, avoiding minimum thresholds after a period of 5 years in that basin. Another concept that we decided to put into the draft document is paths to sustainability. And the idea here is just to explain that your current, or I should say the starting point in terms of where groundwater elevations were at the time the plan was adopted, how that relates to the actual measurable objective and minimum threshold. So in path A, you can see here that groundwater levels decline over time through the 20-year period following GSP submission. And actually, the measurable objective is a little bit lower in terms of where those groundwater levels end up after 20 years of implementation, is a little bit lower than when the plan was adopted or became effective in 2020. And that's okay. In this example, it's showing that you're still obviously above that minimum threshold. Again, this is for illustration purposes. This may not be okay in a given basin that you're involved in, but from a theoretical standpoint, if you will, this is an okay scenario. Same thing with path B. Groundwater levels in this example were well below the measurable objective at the start, or the 2020 when the plan was adopted. And it looks like the GSA made some incremental progress in almost stepwise fashion to achieve that measurable objective over time. Again, the key here being that it's always above the minimum threshold. And in path C, groundwater levels have declined beyond 2015, but remain above the minimum threshold before eventually rising by the end of the 20-year period following GSP submission. So again, the point here is that we're trying to show that each of these examples may be okay in your basin and how the measurable objective relates to the minimum threshold. So undesirable results occurs when any of the 6 sustainability indicators becomes significant and unreasonable, as defined locally. Again, I mentioned undesirable results. The key to defining what undesirable results are is a combination of minimum threshold exceedances. And I'll get into that in an example format here. And it must be eliminated within 20 years of GSP implementation. That being, undesirable results must be eliminated. But some basins can experience undesirable results within the implementation period, and that's okay, as long as they're making progress towards avoiding undesirable results over that 20-year implementation period. And it must be coordinated for the entire basin. So the sustainability goal, again, as shown kind of at the top of the period, it really culminates in the absence of undesirable results within a 20-year period. And the requirements in the GSP regulations, and further described in terms of ways to approach those requirements in the draft Sustainable Management Criteria BMP, is a description of goals should include the information from the basin setting to use to establish the goal, discussion of the measures that will be implemented, and an explanation of how the goal will be achieved within 20 years of the GSP implementation. So again, those are described in the regulations, but there's additional detail in terms of ways to approach that in the draft Sustainable Management Criteria BMP. That is a requirement, again, identified in subarticle 3 of article 5 of the GSP regulations. All right, so here's an example, again, for illustrative purposes only, to try to articulate the relationship between minimum thresholds, undesirable results, and sustainable management. This example is hypothetical and intentionally simplified. We gave this example at a workshop in Clovis, and inevitably somebody came up and said, oh, well, we have to have 8 then, because we have 8 graphs shown here, 8 representative monitoring sites. You might have 8, but you might have 30, you might have fewer than 8. It's really up to the local agencies to define the appropriate number of representing monitoring points in the way to set up the minimum thresholds and description of undesirable results. So this example, again, in this example, I should say that we're using essentially 8 representative monitoring sites, and we're showing undesirable results as the exceedance at 3 of those representative monitoring sites, specifically exceedance of minimum thresholds at 3 of those representative monitoring sites. So here's those 8 representative monitoring sites. So I'm going to go through 3 scenarios. In this first scenario, as shown on the top right, and obviously the hydrology, the minimum threshold, it's identical in all 8 of the representative monitoring sites. In reality, that's not what's going to happen. But again, for illustration purposes only, we use the identical graphs. So in scenario 1, groundwater levels at one of the 8 wells goes below the minimum threshold for a period of time, shown in red below that pink line, which is consistent with the plan interim milestones. Perhaps it even isn't consistent with the plan interim milestones. But the way the local agency in this case, as I mentioned on the previous slide, identified undesirable results in the basin as the exceedance of 3 minimum thresholds, this does not create, even when it's below the minimum threshold, undesirable results in the basin. So there's no undesirable results at any point in time in this example. So let's move to scenario 2. So scenario 2, now we do have the 3 graphics shown in the top right. And again, I mentioned on the previous slide that the exceedance of 3 minimum thresholds, it creates undesirable results potentially in this basin. So in this example, we have those 3 wells go below the minimum threshold. And in this example, again, if you have keen eyes, it's between 2020 and 2030. But again, it's consistent with the plan interim milestones, or consistent with the way the GSP document was designed. And there are no undesirable results in this example at the end of the 20-year implementation period. So that's key here. There are undesirable results for the period which the graphs are below the minimum thresholds, because again, the local agency, the GSA, has identified 3 minimum threshold exceedances causes undesirable results. So from that period to 2020 to approximately 2030, there are undesirable results. But by the end of the 20-year implementation period, the point at which undesirable results cannot be occurring in the basin to show that the basin is being operated to sustainable yield, there are no undesirable results occurring because there are no minimum threshold exceedances by the end of those graphs. So again, more or less what I just explained, although more concise. So finally, scenario 3. In this instance, there are undesirable results. Maybe I'll just pop up the explanation. So here, again, 3 graphs, 3 minimum threshold exceedances. However, it's continued to exceed the minimum threshold throughout the implementation period. So by the end of the 20-year implementation period, which is the end of the graphs, if you will, those 3 wells, and again, the GSA up front has identified that 3 minimum threshold exceedances causes undesirable results. Undesirable results essentially occurred right after the plan was adopted and continue to occur until the end of the 20-year implementation period. So in this basin, there are undesirable results occurring in this basin. This basin is not managing the basin, this basin is not completing its obligation to do sustainable groundwater management, operating to a sustainable yield, and achieving its sustainability goal in this instance because of the occurrence of undesirable results after the end of the 20-year implementation period. So the key to all this, and the reason this is all set up this way in the GSP regulations and then further explained in terms of ways to approach it in this draft BMP document, is this is key to maintaining what is an outcome-based approach to these groundwater sustainability plans. GSAs working with stakeholders considering all the information, technical information, and other information, need to define these outcomes and define and quantify these variables upfront in their groundwater sustainability plans. It's absolutely key so that the department can potentially approve these plans. Without addressing this, the department's not going to be able to approve groundwater sustainability plans. So we have an idea of what constitutes these conditions in each given basin. There is a description in the groundwater sustainability plan regulations that articulates how GSAs can potentially adjust these measurable objectives, minimum thresholds, description of undesirable results with added information. There's a process. So local agencies aren't necessarily locked in forever in terms of how they've set these up, but we do require in these first plans the local agencies describe these conditions and quantify sustainability in their basin. But again, this supports an outcome-driven process to achieve sustainability. And what we're going to talk about kind of at the end of this meeting is, again, DWR's engagement. We're going to have point of contacts and others in the department, and you have questions related to setting up these requirements. The department can't give you advice, cannot give you advice, cannot tell you where to set up, what quantitative value to set your minimum thresholds or measurable objectives, but we can help you further understand these requirements and explain through this BMP document or the GSP regulations. And again, we'll touch on who's available to do that. So again, I mentioned you're brave, hardy. This is kind of a hard topic to get your head around. Hopefully these aren't new terms for many of you. We're going to start out first with just questions in terms of what I presented, the draft BMP, and then after questions, we'll formally stop that and then get into actually public comments. So if you're interested in actually making a public comment as opposed to a question, you'll want to hold those comments until the questions and answer period is over.
Yes, so we have about 15 minutes for Q&A, and this is really your opportunity to have a back and forth discussion with DWR staff, because during the public comments on the sustainable management criteria, DWR will not respond to your comments in this meeting. So I see a question here and in the back. Yes.
Hi, John Ayers, RMC. You laid out that 3 of 8 exceedances at 20 years out was an undesirable result. Why is it 3? Could it be 2? Could it be 4? Could it be 1?
Yes.
How is there any guidance on how agencies can pick that moving forward?
Yeah, so a good question. There is, to your question, yes, it could be different ratios, different counts, different numbers. We purposely did not provide guidance because we didn't want to be prescriptive in that regard. We didn't want to make it 70%, 80%, because it really, again, it's how you look at things in your given basin. I will say, though, it should be reasonable. You need to have this description. It needs to be reasonable and should be vetted, obviously, with stakeholders and others in your basin.
Okay, thank you. We have a question here.
Hi, Susie Bresney with the Stockholm Environment Institute. My question is about the sustainability indicators. In previous reading of other documents, I had the inclination that those were defined by the GSA, but now it sounds like there are 6 of those and they're set and they're previously defined. Is that true?
They are, the sustainability indicators is defined in the groundwater sustainability plan regulations. I'm not sure, to your question, if unfortunately the department uses sustainability indicators in the California Water Plan and in some other circles. We apologize for that because they have different meaning in the context of the California Water Plan. And to be honest, if we were to realize that now, we would probably use a different terminology. So if that's related to your question, please look at the GSP regulations, and I can talk to you after this meeting because it has specific meaning within the sustainable groundwater management plans described in our regulations.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I have a question here, and then I see a couple on the other side of the room. Yes.
I'd like to get something clear, I've understood you correctly. Okay, that the minimum thresholds are actually fairly open for interpretation. Is that correct? The reason I'm asking that is in the area where I'm living, it looks like that could be a very political process in which the powerful have a lot more to say, than perhaps those who have most of the wells. If that's the case, are there any accountability guidelines going to be coming out from DWR on how those decisions should be reached? And how do we just keep the big guys from smashing the little guys?
Yeah. So you're right. And I mean, the minimum thresholds, the details that we went through in the GSP regulations, described in the GSP regulations, again, is that it must be a quantitative value. It must use one of the metrics there as described in the GSP regulations, and then further articulated ways to approach that in the SMC BMP. We also have guidance on stakeholder engagement and involvement in terms of how there's ways to achieve that input throughout this process. I think what we've done in this draft document is laid out those considerations I briefly went through just on the groundwater levels and looking at how to set up minimum thresholds. And so I'd be very interested in comments that you have potentially maybe here or in written form on ways to look at setting up those minimum thresholds.
Thank you. Over here.
Thank you. So I'm wondering about the minimum thresholds. You have them set at like a single level, but do GSAs have the option to do an operating range for their minimum threshold? Because I don't see a groundwater graph looking like this. I see it looking like that.
Yeah, there's really no operating range for a minimum threshold. It's a quantitative value. So you have to consider the historic information. Again, I briefly flashed that up there, the historical information and seasonal variation when setting a minimum threshold. So if there's a lot of variability in your basin, that's something you'll need to consider in terms of maybe setting a minimum threshold that's more conservative to ensure that the local interests are protected with all that variability.
Okay, we have another question here.
Hi, Stephen Punsley, Truckee Donner PUD. When dealing with surface water, groundwater interactions and using groundwater level as a proxy, which makes a lot of sense to a lot of us, there's a challenge in distinguishing between depletions of interconnected surface water due to groundwater pumping versus depletions of interconnected surface water due to changes in climate. And I'd just be curious what advice you would give to try to separate those two so they don't get confused.
Yeah, I don't have any advice, to be honest, right now. It's a good comment, Stephen, and I think it's something we're writing down and maybe we can look at before the final document. But if you have some additional thoughts on that, we'd be interested in your thinking. Thank you.
Leslie Duma, Woodard and Kern. So for the larger groundwater basins, the more complicated ones with, say, 20 or more representative monitoring sites, times the different sustainability indicators, minimum thresholds, measurable objectives, describing your undesirable results, times the amount of information, those, for example, the 6 points that you showed for minimum thresholds, it starts to add up to a very, very, very large chapter in an already large, complicated document. So what level of detail are you expecting? And so, for example, could you just say we're following for water quality primary MCLs, or do we need to call it out specifically for which constituents? I'm trying to kind of get my mind around how we can present this in a concise, reasonable manner without driving everyone insane and putting them to sleep.
Yeah, good question. And we've actually done the math too and seen it quickly, exponentially, it turned into a lot of content. Frankly, it's just something you're going to have to manage in writing these plans. Again, maybe the use of groundwater elevations as a proxy can be used to hit on multiple sustainability indicators, if again that's appropriate and can be used in the basins you're working in. And the description of those 6 items, I briefly went over them to support the minimum threshold. It's possible that the description on some of those items applies to all the minimum thresholds in the same way. And so maybe that could be explained once, and it addresses all, in your example, maybe 20 of the representative monitoring sites in your basin. So we have looked at that, and those are kind of my off-the-cuff answers. But you're right, it's a consideration that will need to be made, is just how complicated do you want to make it in your given basin.
Okay, thank you. There is a question here, and then I'd like to see, are there other questions? Show of hands. Okay, I'll go to you and then back to you. Okay, just want to get a sense because we have about 5 more minutes for Q&A.
Matt Zadar, consultant. I appreciate where DWR is coming from because of the variability on not being prescriptive. But in advising clients, one of my issues is how do we evaluate what is going to be adequate without further guidance, and how do you guys set yourself up for not being called arbitrary when all this starts coming out? There's a follow-up to that.
All right. So, if you meet the GSP regulation requirements, you've met the requirements. And so, we're looking to maintain that local control. So it's imperative to us that we receive complete groundwater sustainability plans. We're not looking to be, and don't perceive, we're not looking to be prescriptive or even describe how these should be advised or addressed specifically in terms of a quantitative value in your basin. That being said, there's other state agencies, there's other stakeholders that may be a stakeholder, obviously, that may be, I should say, other state agencies that may be a stakeholder in your given basin. But the Sustainable Groundwater Management Group, the group here, we're not looking to provide and can't provide you specific guidance on how to set up those requirements.
And as a follow-up to that, looking out into the future, then, you're showing future conditions. How would you advise clients to try to envision those future conditions and test their thresholds and limits and operating assumptions without actually modeling a water budget? I mean, can you do this without a model and forecasting out into the future?
It becomes challenging, I think, and water budgets is a requirement in the Groundwater Sustainability Plan regulations. So, what you saw here today, completing the sustainable management criteria, in and itself doesn't provide you a complete plan. There's a lot of that slide of all of Article 5. I didn't go into any of the detail on the other plan requirements, which again are necessary to provide to the department so that you have a complete plan. But it gets challenging to forecast, that measurable objective, if you will, or that outcome, that final outcome, without doing some modeling. In some cases, numeric or even using an analytical tool. But again, the department is also understands that adaptive management plays a role here, and that some of the projection is more speculative than others, and there's uncertainty and data gaps, which can lead to that obviously speculation in terms of how you've projected those conditions. And that's a fact of where we're at. So we do also describe in the GSP regulations that folks need to identify the uncertainty and look to fill significant data gaps. But upfront, we recognize that those objectives, if you will, those outcome objectives, whether measurable objective or minimum threshold, may change over time.
So my question is in regard to the management actions and projects, and in regards to the ability to only have a single management threshold. If you only have a single threshold, that means you'd almost be obligated to trigger all of your projects for a single management threshold. So is there any possibility to have different degrees of management thresholds to trigger different management options?
To be honest, I'm not sure I understand your question correctly, but let me give you an answer and you can tell me if I'm close. So one, I'm hearing that you're maybe equating minimum thresholds to kind of a singular minimum threshold for the entire basin. that defines undesirable results. And in theory, you could do that, I guess. But that's really, we're talking about a combination of minimum thresholds. So like lady mentioned up here, when you start to identify a lot of representative monitoring sites and a lot of minimum thresholds, it's that combination of minimum threshold exceedances that constitutes or describes or documents an undesirable result in your basin. So some of it might be terminology, but there's one description of really a coordinated description of what undesirable results are in your basin for each of those 6 sustainability indicators. And that's where it starts to get complicated, because when you're looking at minimum thresholds, you're looking at them for each of the sustainability indicators. And then you need to do it for each of the 6. And then you need to describe each of those as what constitutes undesirable results in your basin. So management actions and projects, it's a different section of the GSP regulations, which I didn't touch on at all, but generally what's required, there's a lot of detailed requirements, but a description of when those projects and actions will occur and how it relates to that path, if you will, to achieve sustainability, those interim milestones. So some of that needs to be weaved in to how you plan to achieve your measurable objective. You plan to achieve it by implementing projects and actions. And so we want to know some details about those projects and actions, because we have a ultimate responsibility to determine whether or not the plan's likely to achieve sustainability. And so those projects and actions help tell us whether or not that plan's likely to work.
And we have one final question here.
I think I know the answer to this, but I just want to be sure. All right, so we've got minimum thresholds. The example was the exact same groundwater elevation all the way across. As long as we set those using a similar methodology and justification, the actual elevations could be different in different monitoring wells based on their proximity to a river, or they're up on a hillside, or one doesn't fluctuate much, one fluctuates a lot, that sort of thing.
Yeah, thanks, John, because I think in my example, I didn't touch on that. I mentioned that they're all the same, but I didn't mention that they can be different, certainly. And so those minimum thresholds, we're expecting those quantitative values actually not to be the same in the number of representative monitoring sites throughout the basin. Otherwise, you have a very flat set of groundwater elevations or some very unique condition. So yeah, we expect to see those minimum thresholds in, again, all quantitative values, but different values.
Okay, thank you so much. So now we'd like to move on to the public comment related to the Sustainable Management Criteria, BMP. Could I see just a show of hands if you have if you'd like to make an oral comment? Okay, could I, do you have you all filled out speaker cards? Or they're being filled out. Does anybody who wants to make an oral comment not have a speaker card, and we'll get one to you? All right. Can we have DWR staff please hold up your speaker cards, and DWR staff are going to come around and collect those speaker cards from you, and then I will call you up in the order that I receive those speaker cards. Okay. As we're waiting for those to come up, my colleague Stephanie Horry, who's up here typing, is capturing all of your oral comments today. Remember, if you prefer not to make an oral comment and would like to do so in writing today, you can fill out that comment card. Thank you, Bill. And then, of course, you have an opportunity to email or mail any other written comments to DWR by January 8th. If you make oral comments today whereby you have prepared written comments that you're working off of, in order for us to accurately capture what the information you're providing, we would be very grateful if you could give us those written comments. So we'll make sure that they get entered into the record if you've gone through the work of preparing them in advance. Okay, let's see. Let me just look at these for a second. I'm going to establish the order. So we'll have William Myers, followed by John Woodling, followed by Jennifer Clary, and then is it Debbie Orez? Was that correct? Okay, so that will be the order. Please, just to make this a simple process, go ahead and come up and use this mic that's on the stand. So if we could start with William, let me have it face this way. Oh, no, yeah, yeah. Face that way. There you go. Thanks, William.
Thank you. I want to follow up a little bit on what I was asked about before. And the operational question is whether, if there is a major disagreement between stakeholders, in this case, over the threshold, okay, and can that be appealed to the State Water Control Board, DWR, somebody? In other words, can we get involved in the process of challenging whether or not the plan, GSA plan, will be accepted? Okay, or do we go to court? Okay, and I may have to give you an example of what potentially is shaping up. In parts of this area, there are small landowners with 2, 5, 10 acre kind of thing, okay, are a very large portion of the territory, the southern part of the county. For example, this is on other parts of the state as well, of course. The majority of the wells are of this type. Typically, they draw on very shallow aquifers, depending on when they were put in, roughly from 150 to 300 feet, so most of them are, okay? But they're very susceptible. They don't even have to be pulled down exactly where they are. So we understand it from the hydrologists. Not very far away, a few large wells will actually drop them down, okay? And already, as the conversation is shaping up, it's clear that not only private sector, but governmental bodies have an interest in the rate of development, number of houses that can go out there. There are a lot of other things going into the equation of what they want to do with these areas other than just the water itself. So there are going to be major winners and losers over this. If the sorts of things, let's say the county might want to develop an area for strong urbanization, it might have very strong water impacts on those who have wells that are shallower, but they don't have any political clout, let's say at this point, to compare with, let's say, the large developers or the county or the states, whatever the case may be, okay? So the big question comes up to me, even though they have the large majority of the wells. So the question I would put up, and if there's not, can't be answered now, I think put it up for consideration. How do we get accountability? That's rational, if you want to put it that way, in a way to make sure that that it's not just the big interests to come back in again, and history of water in California is pretty clear along that line. That's where it's been. So how do we build accountability in? And the little guy can't come out in the local plan. Could there be appeal systems in which we can go and, for example, challenge the acceptance of the water plan or whatever? Thank you.
Thank you so much, William. And John Woodling from the Sacramento Groundwater Authority.
Good afternoon, John Woodling, Sacramento Groundwater Authority. Thanks, Trevor. I want to start and first say I think there's a lot of good content in here that really is going to help GSAs understand how DWR interprets the regulations. So I appreciate that, and it is pretty dense, but I think well described. A few specific comments, and then I want to jump back to something more holistic. First specific comment, I think more specific references to the regs. Where you refer to the regs, put citation in there, so easier for people to go back and forth. I think there needs to be some recognition that minimum thresholds, measurable objectives, interim milestones are going to change over time. And I think we want to believe it's a static thing. You either meet it or don't meet it every 5 years and at 20 years, but we're going to learn. Those are going to change up and down for any number of reasons. I think there needs to be more recognition that actual hydrology, in a lot of cases, it's going to drive where you get. And something may be unreasonable if it occurred after 5 wet years compared to if it occurred after 5 dry years. So I think, you allude to it in the document, but I think, all the graphs and everything else show changes with kind of the assumption that everything else is static. From the higher level, I would strongly urge you to reframe this thing as a guidance document. You've written guidance documents for other topics related to Sigma. This isn't best management practice by either the common English use of the words or engineering practice use of the terms. Nobody's done these things before. They haven't been implemented. They haven't been tested. So I think to call them best management practices is one, incorrect. Two, may stifle innovation for people that have better ideas of how to do it. Jennifer Clary asked a question, which made me think somebody could want to do it that way with a range. So I would strongly urge you to make this a guidance document, update it over time. You know, we're going to learn when the overdrafted basins do their GSPs in 2020, 2022, and I think what we may think are BMPs in 2030 is going to be a lot different than it is now. I've told you that before, and it hasn't changed yet, though. Thanks, gentlemen.
Thank you, John. And Jennifer Clary with Clean Water Action.
Thank you. Jennifer Clary, Clean Water Action. So I just have a few comments on working with a few other groups to provide more detail. But first of all, I just want to reiterate, I'm not really comfortable with the minimum threshold as a single point because you operate a groundwater basin to meet different objectives depending on the water year, depending on what you need. And I kind of disagree with John in one point because, you know, I have to, but at some points, like when you're in a 5-year drought, you are going to have undesirable results. So you don't need to set a minimum threshold at the very bottom of where you're going to bottom out in a drought. But I do agree that we need to understand with climate change, with projecting droughts, just what kind of variation we should expect. And you do talk about uncertainty in this document and how do you build uncertainty. And I agree with what you're talking about building a cushion in, but maybe you need a little more, maybe in your graphs you can be a little more explicit about building in that cushion. Because honestly, those graphs, as I look at them, they don't look helpful at all to me. They're not showing you season fluctuations in groundwater, and maybe that's not what you want. Maybe you could just specify that. It doesn't look like what I think a groundwater sustainability plan is going to look like. So just understanding that and also clarifying, you don't always have to dip below the minimum threshold. I know you're trying to give an example of that, but I didn't find it all that helpful. And I'm really concerned about the treatment of interim milestones. I feel you should have a separate section on interim milestones because this is the basis on which you evaluate the plans and upon which you determine whether or not the plans are adequate. So for instance, I'm looking at your example number 3 where you're showing the groundwater basin just going in the toilet. And I'm saying, well, hello, when does the state board take over? Because I assume at some point you're going to realize that things aren't going well and are going to turn them over. And it's not, but you don't really make that point and you don't really give good guidance on what you expect interim milestones to look like. And I know that's going to be super difficult. It's really hard to predict, but that's all the more reason why you need to explain what you expect from those interim milestones. And I think that's about it for me for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And Debbie Orris from Clean Water Center, Community Water Center.
It's okay. We often get
Sorry.
Our organizations often get combined together. So I have just a few comments. One, that average well depth is a poor measurement of undesirable results. It's much too variable. And also including something like groundwater levels as a proxy for all undesirable results is not always appropriate, in particular with groundwater quality. Just because you have your groundwater levels are doing well does not prove that you have good groundwater quality. And I know Sigma is often more focused on quantity than quality, but adequate groundwater management does involve making sure that groundwater quality is sufficient for all beneficial users. And finally, I have a concern that you can determine what combination of minimum thresholds, what combination of minimum threshold exceedances are undesirable results. If you exceed your minimum threshold, there's I think that's kind of it shows that you have a problem. If subsidence is happening at a beyond the minimum threshold, then you probably have other problems, and it also has serious impacts to the basin and infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. I want to just come back to the whole audience. Anybody else, would anyone else like to make an oral comment on the SMC BMP right now? If so, just please hold up your speaker card. Okay. All right. Well, then we're just going to go ahead and close the public comment period, and I will hand it over to Stephen Springhorn, who will be providing a Sigma portal tool demonstration on GSP initial notification. Okay. Take it away, Stephen.
All right, thank you, Tanya. Good afternoon, everyone. As Tanya mentioned, I'll be giving an overview of the GSP initial notification system that we're developing. So Trevor just touched on one of our roles as providing technical assistance, diving into the details of the sustainable management criteria, a critical element of the plan. So this topic is more transitioning to our regulatory or statutory role and how those plans will be submitted to the department. And one of the key first steps of GSP formation and GSP submission to the department is this initial notification. Okay, so today I'll cover an overview of the Sigma portal, DWR Sigma portal. This is where this new GSP initial notification system will be placed. I'll go over some background and context on the process to submit an initial notification to the department, and then touch on the status of existing GSP initial notifications we've received to date, and then talk about how we're transitioning to this new process.
You're too tall for that.
Okay. Disadvantages of being tall. Yes, thank you. Okay, great. And then finish up with where we're headed, the next steps, and links to more information on this topic. So the DWR Sigma portal is essentially the clearinghouse for all of the reported information that we receive related to Sigma. And so this is a public website where we post all of the information we receive from groundwater sustainability agencies and other related entities. There's also areas where the public can view documents we've received and comment on those documents. And then we're continuously developing this portal as we're implementing Sigma. So you can see there's a variety of different components to this, or modules. It started with the basin boundary modifications. This is the area we received that information. Adjudicated reporting information is here. Alternative plan information is here. GSA formation information is here. And then now we're further developing this, the GSP initial notification. And this will also be where GSAs submit their groundwater sustainability plans. So GSP initial notification. So GSAs are required to notify DWR in writing prior to initiating the development of a groundwater sustainability plan. And that's per the regulations section 353.6. And the information that needs to be provided is general information about the GSA's process for developing a GSP, and then how interested parties may contact the GSA and participate in the development and implementation in that plan or plans. This GSP initial notification also initiates public comments, and so the department will accept public comments on proposed plans as required by GSP section 353.8. And then there's some other related Sigma requirements on this topic, such as the GSAs establishing and maintaining a list of interested persons, in the development of the GSP. And then also GSAs must provide a written statement to the legislative body of any city or county within the GSP's boundaries. So those are some other important SIGMA references that are related to this effort. So where we stand now with existing initial notifications is we've had 25 submitted already between December of last year till current. There have been submitted for 17 basins or subbasins, and they've been submitted by 22 GSAs. And so what that shows is there's the differences of the numbers here shows there's multiple submissions for the same basin. There's some basins in the San Joaquin Valley where multiple GSAs have submitted because multiple plans are planned to be developed there. And DWR will be working with those GSAs that have already submitted to transfer over to this new system. And so that information on the current initial notifications is posted on that web link at the bottom of the figure there, the picture. And here's just a map of where those 17 basins are where we've received initial notifications. And as you would imagine, that the majority of the GSP development is occurring in those critically overdrafted basins in the San Joaquin Valley because they have the first deadline to submit their plans, January of 2020. So where we're headed from here is our new initial notification process will be online. It'll be an online form, very similar to how GSAs were submitted. You'll need to log in using your GSA credentials because only GSAs can submit an initial notification per the regulations. And there's some tools. The system is built in a way that there's some public tools and some GSA tools, and I'd like to highlight those now. So for the public side, public access, there are two main pieces of information that this tool will provide. It's a list of all of the initial notifications that we receive. And an important point is that whenever we receive initial notification, we're required to post it online within 20 days. So this will allow us to comply with our responsibilities in this process and also make information widely available for folks to see the current status of GSP development in the basins throughout the state. And so it's a bit hard to see, but in this list of all of the applications or initial notifications, there's the ability to provide a comment. And this, as I mentioned, opens up when an initial notification is submitted. And a notification of public comments will be emailed to the department as well as to the GSAs that submitted the initial notification. So they'll be made aware of public comments that have been received. Another public tool is the map showing where all these initial notifications are being submitted. So you can click on a basin and see, get contact information and more information on that initial notification and that GSP development process. So, and all of that, what I just showed, it doesn't require a login. So the next component of this initial notification process is the local agency or GSA portion. And that does require a login because GSAs only are required to submit these initial notifications. So you have to log in, and it's, again, very similar to the GSA and other modules that a lot of people have already come into this system and used. So there's two major areas. Well, really one is that there's a short form that has to be filled out, that just a series of questions that correspond to the regulation requirements. Sort of, are you planning to submit a single GSP for the whole basin, multiple GSPs in the basin? Which GSAs are going to be part of those plans? Information on the boundaries of those GSPs, if there are multiple GSPs in the basin, and then information on the point of contact, or what is called a plan manager. That would be a point of contact between the department and the GSAs in the basin. And then information on how local agency or other local agencies or stakeholders can get involved in the GSP preparation, and then a link to a website of where that GSP information for that basin will be posted. So there are some new terms and some new process here. So we are developing an FAQ for this. Our team is developing that, and we'll have that available for when this system launches. And I'll touch on when we plan to transition over to this new system in a moment. So as you can tell, we're having a public meeting now about this. We'll also be providing additional information at the other public meetings this week, and we'll be holding a instructional webinar later or in early January to do a demo, an in-depth demo of this, to make sure that people understand how to do this, and we can be answering questions, and we will record that and put it on our website. So stay tuned for that, and then we plan to launch the initial notification system in January. So if there's a case where a GSA or someone that a GSA you're working for is ready to submit an initial notification today, it still would be through the existing process where you're sending a letter to our program, and we'll transition that over. So that's an important point. If you feel like you need to submit that right away, but the system will be live in January to take on what we think will be a lot more initial notifications in the coming weeks to months. And with that, I'll just leave this up with my contact information. If you have additional questions about initial notification, please contact me or take a look at the Sigma portal. There's some information. There will be information there shortly. If you haven't already, please sign up for our DWR email listserv, because we'll be providing additional information on the rollout of this new tool. And then I encourage you to reach out to the regional office contacts that are here today, and then throughout the other regions in our state. They have a lot of information on this, and they'll be able to help you as well. So with that, we can wrap that up, and thank you.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Before we move on and we talk a little bit more about your regional points of contact around the state, I'd like to make sure that you're able to discuss this presentation with DWR. So are there any questions about Stephen's presentation? Yes, I see Jennifer in the back there. Good. Questions are really good.
It's a very quiet crowd. So I just had a question about the public comment period. One, of course, there wasn't the option on the old system, so I assume we'll have a public comment period for old notifications that are posted. And are you thinking like you can comment anytime, you need to comment within 30 days? Just because I'm wondering how often I have to check that website.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, so the existing notifications will be transferred over, and that will allow for public comments to be attached to those notifications. And so there really isn't a public comment period because it just remains open. But we should be clear that the comments on initial notification will occur through this module, and then there's a specific comment period, a 60-day comment period, once an adopted plan is submitted to the department. And so that is separate. So that would be initiated once an adopted plan is submitted to the department.
Okay, yes, I'll come to you in a second. Debbie, I want to get a sense of, are there other questions? Okay, coming back to you, Debbie.
I know the GSP regulations mention it's for commenting on plans, so 60 days, but also the Sigma regulations say at least 60 days. If there are multiple plans being submitted at and around the same period of time, will DWR be expanding the comment period to allow everyone who wants to and needs to comment on these plans to have adequate time to do so?
All right, thank you for that question. So at this time, we can't really say what that will be. We know that we are required to have at least 60 days, so we'll likely look at what is going on at that time of plan submission and make the determination at that time.
Sorry, one more question. So I'd sent this question via email, but I didn't really like the answer, so I'm going to ask it again, which is what constitutes initiating development of a plan? What is the trigger for initial notification? Is it a specific action, like if you act on a contract with a consultant, is that initial? Is it before that? I mean, what action at the local level triggers that requirement?
Yeah, thank you for that. And that is a tricky question. And that really is a locally defined or determination is what constitutes the initiation of their plan within that basin. So that will be determined by the GSAs in the basin.
Did you have a follow-up? Okay. Any final questions on Stephen's presentation? All right, let's move on to, thank you, Stephen. Let's move on to the points of contact to make sure that you understand who you should be in touch with within the various basins and what the role is of the points of contact. So before I hand it over to the regional staff, you can see on this slide that we have two representatives from the Northern Region staff, or the NRO, and that's Pat Valines, if you could raise your hand, Pat, and then Michelle Dooley, also, here she is, from NRO, and then from the NCRO, or their North Central Region office in West Sacramento, we have Bill Brewster over here, and Paul Wells over there. And so I'll hand it over to Paul now, and he'll tell us a little bit more about what the distinct roles are of the points of contact, and then we'll make sure that you all know who your regional points of contact are for your various basins. Paul.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm just going to quickly describe what the point of contacts and what they do. The role really is to be basin-specific point of contact at DWR that people can work with, including the groundwater sustainability agencies, stakeholders, other local agencies. So part of it is to coordinate DWR's assistance and local engagement program. And part of our efforts include day-to-day correspondence. So to handle kind of incoming questions, whether it be through the telephone or email, on just general questions regarding SGMA requirements. We'll also assist with planning and technical support and assistance. And as things get a little more in-depth, as GSAs develop their groundwater sustainability plans, there is a meetings that we will assist with, which when the basins have more complicated questions and we need to rely on subject management experts at DWR, we will bring them to the meeting. So the POCs assist with kind of putting these meetings together with the GSAs and getting technical expertise from SGMA staff to those meetings to address what may be unique issues for that basin as they develop their GSP. So typical duties could be including helping with technical support, regulatory issues like the GSP initial notification, just kind of informing them of requirements as they kind of come along the SGMA timeline. It could be like grant opportunities, like the recent PSP and GSP, groundwater sustainability plans and project grants that recently closed, and facilitation support. POCs will also attend board meetings and can attend technical advisory groups for the basins. And they will efficiently route requests to appropriate managers and experts. So they basically help link, like I mentioned with the meetings, link basin staff and basin questions with SGMA experts when the time needs, if they can't answer that question themselves. And the next slide, I believe, just has the webpage for our communication and outreach efforts. And on that webpage, there are links to maps, which we'll show in a minute, of the POCs for each of the regional offices. Yeah, so the maps are available on the table outside, as well as additional handouts. And so now I will turn it over to Pat to discuss the POCs at the Northern Region Office.
Thanks, Paul. This is Pat Valines, and I'm out of Red Bluff. And here's our map of the Northern Region Office Sigma points of contact. In the yellow, Shell Dooley has the bulk of the subbasins: Eel River Valley, Anderson, Enterprise, Bowman, Antelope, Dye Creek, Los Molinos, Vina, Red Bluff. My point of contact areas are Scott River Valley in Siskiyou County, Shasta Valley, and Butte Valley. Aaron Smith is the point of contact for Big Valley, Tule Lake, and Corning. Shane Edmonds is a contact for Scotts Valley and Big Valley down by Lake. Debbie Spangler is the contact for West Butte, East Butte, Wyandotte Creek, and Sierra Valley. And Roy Hull is the contact for Calusa and Smith River Plain up in the Northwest.
Thank you. So this is the slide for the basins and the point of contacts for the North Central Region Office. We have 7 points of contact. One regional coordinator. I'm the regional coordinator for the office, who kind of helps coordinate that effort, as well as Bill Brewster, who's the groundwater lead. So we work together actually to coordinate the groundwater POC outreach effort. So those are the names of the people that you can contact. You can contact any of us though, because basically we all work together to support the effort. Each point of contact will be the expert for their basin, so they will understand the unique issues related to that basin. But we all are tasked with kind of understanding Sigma requirements as they come up and roll out, and helping the GSAs and other stakeholders understand what they are. And the next 2 slides cover the point of contacts for the South Central Region Office. And so these are available on that engagement and outreach webpage as well. So you have a little more time to print those up and study. And then we have the Southern Region Office and their point of contacts down there. So again, each basin, medium and high priority, has a point of contact at DWR at the region office to help answer questions related to Sigma.
Okay, Trevor would like to just tell us a little bit more about the POCs.
Yeah, thank you. So obviously you can tell we're trying to get organized to provide as much engagement as we can during this critical phase of local agency, stakeholder engagement, and plan preparation. With anything that we do, it's not going to necessarily be perfect. And so bear with us as we gear up our engagement. I know you don't have a lot of time to prepare your plans. These entities may not be able to answer every question that you have, but they will be a hub to get that information back to either the Sacramento area, and hopefully we can address it. The regional office staff know you best. We don't know you as well in Sacramento. So it really goes both ways for us. The regional offices know the groundwater conditions, know the locals, know the local issues. We're a little bit in dark in Sacramento, and so we get to communicate with our folks, regional office folks internally, to strengthen our understanding of what's happening out there. At the same time, the folks out the point of contacts being in the regional offices, they may not know the latest on Sigma related activities, although we try to get that information out to them as soon as possible. So again, we're trying to strengthen this relationship between our what we call our headquarters, our Sacramento group that really works on the Sigma program, with our regional offices. So when you engage with these POCs, please do engage with them. Please route questions, information you have. In many cases, hopefully they'll be able to get your questions answered or provide some support to you on technical assistance or other activities. In some cases, they may need to route it back to hopefully get you the support you need. So we appreciate you being patient and letting us explain this engagement process to you.
Thank you, Trevor. And I'm going to actually hand it off to you in a minute to make closing remarks, but just want to make sure that if anyone has filled out a comment card, that you give this to me before you leave so that we make sure that it is a part of the record. And thank you all for taking the time to come. And I'll pass it back to you, Trevor, to close the meeting.
Well, thank you. So again, I know this is kind of the brave and hardy crowd, because the SMC BMP is not the easiest thing to probably get your head around. It's absolutely imperative, though, for those of you involved in the plan preparation or stakeholder, that hopefully you have a clear understanding of what the department requires in the regulations and how we can provide some guidance and assistance through this document. So we appreciate the comments that we heard today, and please, again, these are only value added if you provide those comments to us, whether it's the best management practice document, the notification tool. So we appreciate your time today, but if you get a chance and think of more comments or can articulate things, please send us those comments by January 8th. We appreciate it. Thank you.